On the 10th of April 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton. The ship was on her maiden voyage to New York City, where from berth 44 from Southampton docks, the trip would take 7 days. But with a journey like Titanic's, what food would her passengers have had on board? In this mini-series, we are going to be showing and discussing what food that was served in all 3 classes. This is Le Restaurant Titanic. On the 15th of April 1919, a New York collector named Richard Minster purchased the last dinner menu from the Cafe Parisian for $31,300. The first-class menu, possibly a luncheon one that was dated the 14th of April 1912, was believed to have been rescued by passenger Adolphe Salford, who later preserved it on the walls in his office at Salford & Co. Limited. In 1953, it was given away as a retirement gift to an unnamed accountant. This menu would have been unique compared to the other menus on the Titanic, as it was described in the Irish Times as valuable, despite it being a disposable piece of paper, which could have happened to some menus back in 1912. In the last episode, we looked into the a la carte restaurant and the staff who worked there. In this episode, we will be moving on to its next-door neighbour, the Cafe Parisian. Considered one of the luxury innovations on board the Titanic, the Cafe Parisian was the first for first-class passengers who were looking for a less intimate space to have their meals, or should they wish to have mid-morning refreshments or the traditional afternoon tea. However, the story of the Cafe Parisian is a mystery considering its publicity in shipping magazines at the time. There's some information we do know which describes what the cafe would have been like on board the RMS Titanic and its legacy on the RMS Olympic following the sinking in April 1912. While we cannot be sure which restaurant or cafe inspired the Cafe Parisian, we do know that the cafe resembled the Bouquet or Bijou cafes that were located in Paris, the capital city of France. It could have been possible that the inspiration for the cafes came from J. Bruce Ismay himself. Before he joined the White Star Line, Ismay travelled to France where he continued his tuition. There's no further information on how long he stayed, but if Ismay liked the idea of having a Parisian modern cafe in his later years, he must have sounded like that he had fond memories of attending a regular cafe while living in Paris. At the time of its fitting, the Titanic became the first ship to have a Parisian cafe on board, and during her maiden voyage, the cafe was one of its kind. That was until her sister ship, the Olympic, had one installed in 1913. The company that would design the interiors for the cafe were Alden Heaton and Company Limited. At the time of the Titanic's construction, the company were owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company. Alden Heaton & Co. was founded by artist John Alden Heaton, whose company would produce furniture, stained glass, wallpaper, textiles, and interior designs. But somehow the company would have constructed the interiors in various locations, including Southampton and Belfast at the Harlander Wharf shipyard. Some of the company's wallpaper survived, and a piece of it is now shown at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. As for the cafe itself, the Cafe Parisian was reported to have been measured at around 84 feet long and a little over 17 feet wide. The cafe wasn't designed to be this large. Instead, the original plans for the Titanic were to have a large promenade deck be built along the entire B deck for passengers who wished to have a constitutional stroll and relax in the open sea air. These were later changed following observations from the RMS Olympic during her maiden voyage in June 1911. As a result of these changes, cabins were made smaller, 2 sections of the public promenade deck became a new set of private promenades. The a la carte restaurant became larger, which included a new reception room, and the cafe, which became another new section on the promenade deck. The Cafe Parisian was located on B deck, which was next door to the a la carte restaurant. Upon entering, passengers would have been welcomed into a similar sunroom-like feel with a height of luxury, but since the cafe was reserved for first-class passengers only, prices weren't cheap. Similar to its next-door neighbour, the a la carte restaurant, the cafe wasn't owned by the White Star Line, and passengers had to purchase separate tickets to dine at the cafe. Whether passengers could book separate tickets for one of each place or purchase to dine at both the cafe and the restaurant under one ticket, it's difficult to say. However, with their tickets, the passengers would have entry champagne, canapes, a second course set menu and musical entertainment. A full menu service inside the cafe would be obtained as early as 8 a.m. to as late as 11 p.m, though light refreshments were also offered on board. The food would have been prepared in the same galleys sharing with the a la carte restaurant. Both the cafe and the restaurant would have been owned and operated by famous restaurateur Luigi Gatti, along with his staff of talented chefs and bakers. One such baker who would was Henri Marie Juliet, and forgive me, I pronounced the surname wrong, but my French is not that great. Anyway, sticking on to the script now. Joliet emigrated to England from France in the early 1900s, where he worked as a domestic chef in the employment of Baron William McBride. By 1912, he had worked as a baker on the Cunard liner, the RMS Lusitania. He signed on to the Titanic on the 6th of April 1912, giving his address as 4 Queen's Park Terrace, London. When he boarded the Titanic, he signed on as a member of the a la carte restaurant and was paid by Gatti. Gatti would also employ hundreds of French cooks, Italian waiters who would deliver little refreshments for food service and beverages to the passengers. One of these assistant waiters was David Bow. Born in Italy, Bow moved to Britain, possibly with his brother, and began working for Gatti. He signed on to the Titanic as an assistant waiter on the 6th of April. He joined the ship a few days later before she departed from Southampton. Joliet and Bow would have had busy shifts during their time on board and working in the lively Cafe Parisian. For waiters like Bow and the first-class passengers, the sights would have been incredible. During the day and night, the cafe would have attracted passengers with the restaurant's finest colours, beautiful scenery and rich decorations. When it came to the activities, the atmosphere inside the Cafe Parisian would be lively and colourful. Every day, the first-class passengers, whether they would be young individuals or in groups, would have descended the grand staircase on B deck before processing to the cafe for social gatherings or some time alone. Walking through sets of double doors, waiters would guide passengers to their tables. It is not known where they come out from, but when the passengers arrive at the tables, they would have been greeted with champagne towers. The environment was full of bright colours as the cafe would have been decorated with ivy-coloured trestles and fake vines with light wood, wicker furniture, a dresser for crockery, and included top-quality Crown Derby china to serve food. The cafe also had a view of the sea from the Titanic's large windows, which were mostly open. If there was bad weather afoot, the windows would be rolled down and passengers could dine al fresco. When it came to refreshments, especially for brunches and afternoon tea, passengers would have been served teas, coffees and light bites, which included sandwiches, cakes, pastries and bread, which would have been laid out at certain times of the day. Although the Cafe Parisian would have had its own set of menus, it would also have copies from the a la carte restaurant. While it's not clear which food items from the a la carte restaurant are popular inside the cafe, the items would likely have included oysters, salmon, pâté de framboise, which is the liver of a duck or a goose, and eclairs. As the White Star Line added the cafe as a new addition to the Olympic-class liners, it was considered the go-to place on board the ship. The Cafe Parisian mainly attracted young passengers, and it is believed that married young couples would dine there in the evenings. There were 13 honeymooners on board the Titanic during her maiden voyage. One of these couples was Lucien P. Smith and his wife Mary Eloise Hughes Smith. Having recently married following a brief courtship in February 1912, Lucien and Mary enjoyed a 2-month honeymoon across the world. After travelling on board the Olympic a month before, Mary remarked these words to a ticketmaster in Cherbourg: "Let's hope the Titanic doesn't throw another propeller blade." This was a reference to an incident the Olympic was involved in before she travelled back to Belfast. Another couple who likely dined in the cafe were newlyweds Dixon Bishop and Margaret Walton Bishop. The pair were returning home to Michigan after spending a 4-month honeymoon in Egypt before travelling to Italy, the Algiers, and France. And like Mary Smith, Helen was expecting. As well as the honeymooners, the Cafe Parisian was a popular place to go for the Titanic's younger and older passengers too. 3 of these passengers were Helen Churchill Candy, Colonel Archibald Gracie, and Major Archibald W. Butt. Helen Churchill Candy was a divorced woman, and despite being in her 50s, she was quite a catch. She caught the attention of at least half a dozen men, including Gracie himself, who seemed inclined to protect her. There's even a theory that she fell in love with an unknown man and was up to mischief. Their naughty tricks would have been the inspiration for the infamous "I'm flying" scene from the 1997 movie by James Cameron. Despite being a popular catch, and maybe this flirtation would have been a distraction for her, Helen had a main reason to travel back home. In the spring of 1912, Helen was travelling in Europe for research for her book, The Tapestry Book. While in Paris, she received a telegram explaining that her son had been injured in an accident. In response, she quickly purchased a ticket for the Titanic and departed to sail on board from Cherbourg. Colonel Archibald Gracie was also on holiday in Europe and Britain before he travelled on the Titanic from Southampton. Gracie enjoyed his time on board the Titanic as he spent his time chaperoning unaccompanied women and reading books or having conversations with individuals in the first-class library, and one of these individuals Gracie would have a chat with were the Strausses. Major Archibald Butt was an aide-de-camp to American President William Taft when he boarded the Titanic. Butt had been ordered to take leave as he was suffering from depression and exhaustion. After spending 6 weeks in Europe, he boarded the Titanic in Southampton, and as he did on the 14th, he would have spent time socialising with fellow passengers and playing a game of cards probably every night during the voyage. During the voyage, men would use either the smoking room or the cafe for the evening's entertainment, and this was the case for one particular game of bridge, which was played on the night of the 14th of April. However, playing on the Sabbath or holy day, with it being a Sunday, would have been considered as a bad omen to gamble on the day of rest. But that's only for the suspicious type. Before the iceberg collision, a few passengers noted that the weather had dropped, and because of its decline, the Cafe Parisian was quite chilly. During the evening, the passengers would have been treated to lavish meals, maybe the same meals as the ones that they served in the a la carte restaurant. Sitting in the cafe and enjoying the meal were a small group of people which were known as our coterie. In the group, some writers would gather every evening to discuss works of literature, whether their own or other authors. These members were Helen Churchill Candy, Colonel Archibald Gracie, Edward Kent, Hugh Walner, Edward Coley, Clint Smith, and Moritz Stephenson. The group would often discuss what they have read and wrote and share their opinions on them, as well as debate on them, or share ideas for books while dining. On the night of the 14th, Gracie recollects persuading the group to read his book, The Truth About Chickamauga, after he discussed the subject with Isidor Straus in the first-class library. When the group were in mid-conversation, they would have been treated for fine dining, with meals including cream of barley soup, oysters, roast duckling, chocolate, and vanilla eclairs. After the dessert, many members of the group excused themselves for the night, except for Edward Kent, who was later joined by Spencer V. Silverthorne, Hugh Walner, Lucian P. Smith, Perry Marshall, Paul Chevery, and A.F. Omelette. However, by 11:30 p.m, the temperature dropped and the cafe became freezing. So to keep warm, the men moved to the first-class smoking room, where some will never be seen again. Next time, we will be looking into the history of the Palm Court and the Vendera Cafe.